Hi, everyone. My name is Gordon. This is my sign name. And I will be talking about today my journey through receiving my PhD degree as a deaf person. And thank you very much for inviting me for this. Peter, specifically, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm honored to present to you all today. So I want to give an overview of what I'll share today. First, I grew up in Florida and then moved to California for my undergraduate degree. And then from there, I moved to New York. And then when I was between my undergraduate and postgraduate, meaning my PhD program, New York is where I learned ASL. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And then I moved from New York to Chicago. And Chicago is where I received my PhD from the University of Chicago. And finally, I moved to Santa Cruz, California for my postdoctorate. So I will talk about some of those different transitions briefly. And really, my primary focus today will be the last part, my time here in California and the work that I've been doing on access, communication access, and things along those lines here in Santa Cruz. So there are a few overall themes here that I'll be discussing today, and this is a list of them. I want to talk about the different types of accommodations that I've gotten. And I want to somewhat tell the story of how I navigate that, how I approach other people, including school administrators and others, on getting the access services that I need and the accommodations for myself. I'll talk a little bit about deaf labor as well. And I really want to focus on Santa Cruz and talk more about my experience with international accommodations. Because, of course, as you know, the Americans with Disability Act only applies here in the United States. It doesn't apply to other countries. And then finally, I will talk about training other people and the potential of sharing that deaf labor and sharing that with others as well. So I'll talk about my time growing up in Florida. I was born and raised in South Florida. But my parents didn't know that I was deaf until I was 3 years old. They found out that I was deaf through testing, and I received a cochlear implant at that time, and hearing aids, hearing aids, not cochlear implant. And back then, that was in the 90s in Florida. Really, in southern Florida, there were no deaf schools in the area. And most of the deaf schools were in northern Florida, but my parents didn't want to move close to there and didn't want me being too far away. So they decided that the best support for me would be to use only spoken English and not to use sign language. So I did grow up oral. And these are some different pictures of me growing up. And you can see that I have the headband on in all of these pictures. It's almost like a hat. I guess it's more comfortable for me. I'm used to wearing it. And I also used to play tennis, so I wore it for playing tennis too. So to talk a little bit more about the school system, I started in a Montessori school. And if you're familiar with Montessori schools, they're somewhat of a special education approach, but they are private schools that focus on encouraging children to develop, encouraging childhood development. And then after that, I went to public schools throughout high school. And most of the supports that I've had are through teachers and speech therapists and school administrators, really. Those are the three primary sources of supports for me. I did have IEPs, that's the individual education plans for school. That's the paperwork that describes literally everything that I would have needed that the school was required to give me for my education. And that was most of my supports. I did have an FM system that I would use. I gave a microphone to the teacher so that I could hear them more clearly in my hearing aid, but that was weird. The FM system is really weird because I could hear them sometimes outside of the classroom talking too. So there were a number of different things that I used, but I really didn't know about interpreting or ASL. I was very unaware about sign language as an option until I was much older when I discovered more of the possibilities that I could have. I moved to California for college, and I went to Caltech, California Institute of Technology. I received my Bachelor's of Science in Physics from Caltech. And for the most part, I didn't use any new accommodations at Caltech, but I did go to the dean's office to get a copy of my IEP. And really, that showed what I needed in high school and public schools in the past. And I had hoped for the same or similar accommodations in college. So for the first 3 years that I was at Caltech, I had note taking, and that was it. That was it. And really, that was not easy because mostly at the last year, my senior year at the school, I had a professor who had a very strong accent. And so I, in particular, struggled to understand him. And that's when they suggested that I try CART, live captioning. So I decided to try using CART, and then found it to be much easier, so I used it from then on. And at that time, because I had moved from Florida to California, over 3,000 miles, of course, my parents couldn't help me, and so I had to learn how to advocate for myself on my own. But I, was able to continue doing that, but it was not the best at that time. I am still improving even today, but I've definitely come a long way since that time too. So the dean was helpful, and I also had friends who supported me there too. So after I graduated from Caltech, I moved to New York, again, to the other side of the country from the West Coast to the East Coast. And I did an internship at Facebook. I was there at Facebook for about 4 months. I don't remember exactly, but it was an odd time, some partying that happened there in New York. But I had some friends from Boston, and that at that time they taught me sign language. So Jenny and West were very helpful for teaching me sign language and exposing me to ASL at that time. I would go to coffee chats, 3 times a week, and picked up ASL through informal conversations there at those types of social events. But I never had formal training or education in ASL. So sometimes I feel like I sign more English than ASL, but I am still learning, of course. A funny story about being in New York: the first guy that I met there was Polish. His full name was Christoph, and he went by Chris. And he taught me ASL, but really it was more like Polish sign language, but I didn't realize it at the time. So for 3 weeks, I was learning just Polish sign language from him, and then I had to sort of backtrack and relearn ASL. So there's a funny story about how I started learning sign language. So I was there for a few months, maybe 4 months, and then I moved to Chicago, and I started my PhD program at the University of Chicago. At that time, I felt confident enough that I wanted to hire an interpreter for a few things. So I used, at the University of Chicago, both interpreters and CART. I used a mix of accommodations for everything. And I continued to use those supports, but I also worked very closely with, I believe the acronym was the ODS, the Office for Disability Services, or Office for Disability Students. I think it was ODS, DOS, something like that. Every institute has a different name for it. But At the University of Chicago, I had no real issues. There were some small things that would come up. So, for example, finding interpreters who knew science vocabulary and who knew the science jargon. I would have to work with the interpreters to teach them some of that jargon. So that was somewhat of a struggle. But in Chicago, I had a pool of interpreters who knew me because they had come to interpret for all of my different activities. And most of the time, they might struggle with the physics concepts or they might struggle with the accents. And so many of them told me that it was exhausting. So I did work with a number of different interpreters. It wasn't a very small pool of interpreters that I worked with. So you can see Chicago, some pictures of Chicago here, the Chicago bean. And then this is foreshadowing. Here, the middle picture is CERN. This is Director General of CERN, who is really runs all of CERN, the director for all of the international labs at CERN. So it was nice to meet them then and then to meet them again. And they asked me at the time to do some videos and some tours in ASL to show how they had improved their procedure and to talk about deaf people at CERN too. And then here at the bottom is a Halloween picture hosted by Crom Saunders. So that was a very fun Halloween party that I attended there. So that was the University of Chicago. And then I went back again from the East Coast to sort of the Midwest and then to the West Coast to Santa Cruz, California. So I've ping ponged across the country a few times now. In Santa Cruz, I am in my postdoctorate program now. And I have the same interpreters most of the time whenever possible. And I also continue to use CART. And I'll explain the differences between those and why and how I use those a little bit more later. So at the University of Chicago, I worked with ODS and with the dean at my previous school. And at that time, that was primarily about educational access, but now it's more about employment access. So the laws are somewhat different in those two areas. And so now instead of working with ODS, I had to work with HR, human resources, and I was completely responsible for advocating for myself and my needs. So that led to some new challenges for captions in particular. Some of the captionists who work there could not handle the workload because I had so many meetings at the time. So I work with CERN, and many people don't know what CERN is or think it's something hidden, but CERN is in Geneva, in Switzerland, and CERN is located right at the border between France and Switzerland. So it's right there in the middle, right underneath the border. And I have some better pictures of it later that I'll show to you. But the picture on the right that you can see here is the Matterhorn mountain in Switzerland as I was hiking it. It's absolutely beautiful, really breathtaking. So CERN is an international lab. It's a collaboration of over 100 different countries and 20,000 scientists who work there, engineers, scientists, students, professors, technicians, management, everyone, over 20,000 different people who work there. And CERN has led to some unique challenges because it is international. So it is a commingling of many people from many different countries. And sometimes it can be difficult for us to all understand each other. So CERN, most of my work with CERN is related to outreach, and most of it is remote. So CERN has a museum called the Microcosm. And it's a small museum there where they have videos in ASL that I did And there are videos in both ASL and LSF, long distance process. And those videos are online on YouTube. So you can click on these links to access them through CERN. And I'll email my slides later so that everyone can receive my slides after the presentation. So some of the pictures that you can see here, I'll explain a little bit about the picture at the top right first. So does anyone recognize that? Do you know what that is? It's cheese. It's actually Gruyere cheese. And each wheel of cheese is worth about $25,000. So you can see these rows of cheese here is probably worth 30 or $300 million worth of cheese that you can see just in this picture. And it's protected by glass, so you can see it, but you cannot access it. You can't touch it, but it's delicious. So I consider working as a physicist to be a full-time job, but then also advocating for myself as a full-time job too. The reason for that is because of all of the different locations. So wherever the meeting happens, or the conference, or the workshop could be international, I'm likely flying there, or it could be remote. So everything that I do, every meeting or conference or workshop that I attend, for each of those, I have to schedule myself for it and then email the appropriate person to request accommodations for it. So that involves working with and collaborating with 20,000 different people who email me every day. Sometimes for meetings, we try to keep meetings on time, but I'm constantly managing my emails, attending different meetings. And at the same time, like I said, this is a multicultural institute. So some people don't naturally think about access services or people with disabilities. So I also have to be careful and be sensitive that they may not have the same perspective about my access services as an American does. So some countries view people who are deaf to be disabled, and they may look down on that, for example. So I have to be careful not to upset anyone and not to start any wars over my request for access services.
This requires a lot of prep work, a lot of that deaf labor that I was talking about, and a lot of educating the interpreters related to signs that I might use. And then again, remember, I have my full-time job as a physicist as well.
I am a physicist, a particle physicist. As such, I am a collaborator and mentor, a physicist, a data analyst, and an engineer. I do all of those things, really. That means that I am a mentor to students. I help guide them along their path to their Ph.D. as well. But also because I myself am a physicist, I am working to find new standard models to match existing theories also. The standard model should match a theory and vice versa. So that is what I work on. I analyze data. I score data. I code data. I make pictures and graphs out of that data that I analyze. I communicate with engineers on how to measure what they're measuring. I'm not a mechanical engineer myself, but I do have to communicate with those people. And we support each other to develop new hardware and to make improvements for the next iteration of the physics program. There was a program that began in the 1980s that will not be completed until probably the 2050. A typical week for me is or regular standard meetings that we have on a regular basis. You can see an example of my weekly schedule on the right-hand side. Begins about 6 in the morning Easter time, ends around 6 p.m. But I often have meetings early in the morning, typically very early in the morning. There's also a lot of overlap. The overlap is really ridiculous. In a typical week, a typical day, I might be in one meeting and then have to jump from that one directly into another meeting and do that continuously throughout the day. When meetings are scheduled, I contact the coordinator about captioning or interpreters. I have to decide whether or not I want one or the other or both and which will be provided. Most often, the meetings that are video only, I'll have captioning services. If they're partly in person, partly video, or if they're workshops or conferences, I prefer to have an interpreter. It does depend. If the meetings are very early in the morning or late in the evening, often it's easier to get a captionist from different places in the world. I don't like to force interpreters to wake up at 3 in the morning, get out of bed to interpret for a meeting for me. So I often, in those situations, will choose captioning. And now with the coronavirus pandemic, I often have captioning for my meetings, not always interpreters. Now, related to communication, a lot of our collaborations are international. And we communicate asynchronously, actually. So we can communicate through text-based methods, maybe email, and I might email the person so it's in their inbox when they start work the next day. We use WhatsApp, Twitter, Hangouts, Slack, a variety of different methods for communication. Computer-based communication methods are popping up all over the place now, more so than they used to be. And really, I feel quite lucky as a deaf person because in the job that I have, we do communicate with a lot of international partners and collaborators. And everyone is used to using text-based communication. So I don't have to explain to them that this is a better method for me. Also, many international people do not use English or speak English as their first language. And so it might be helpful for them also communicating through written English. Now, related to interpreters and how I manage those situations that involve interpreters, I do have a large pool of interpreters that I can choose from for a variety of needs, whether it be a meeting or a workshop or whatever the case may be. I do have an example on the next slide, but you can see different communication apps that I use. For example, WhatsApp, I use with one interpreter from China. They do not have Facebook in China, so we have to use WhatsApp so that we can communicate that way. And I use these different apps to communicate with the interpreters ahead of time related to prep materials and what to expect in the situation, and then also after the interpreting situation, we can debrief, we can talk about what happened, learn from that experience, and make any changes that we may need to make for the next time. But the most common feeling from my interpreters is a feeling of brain dead after working with me for a period of time. One example of a story that I published to Twitter, I think it was last year. I was in Lecce, Italy. The conference that was hosted there, physicists across the world flew to Italy. And no, I don't speak Italian, but I needed to have interpreters that knew ASL. Italian Sign Language is not the same as American Sign Language. Before I flew there, I had to find a way to make it happen that an interpreter could come with me, but we had to discuss who would pay for the interpreting services. Because it was an international experience, it's not as easy to convince the host institution to pay for interpreting services. They don't have the Americans with Disabilities law like we do here in America. So my university, for this conference in Italy, and any conferences moving forward, my university decided that they would cover the costs for any of their employees who needed interpreting access services. I emailed with the university administrators and talked with them until they decided to make that decision. Now, someone did ask me how I found the 2 interpreters that I had for the conference. The 2 interpreters that I found were experienced interpreters, but not experienced with physics. You know, it's not like they became physicists and then later decided to become interpreters. That's not the case. I had to teach the interpreters physics, which is fine, but I cannot teach interpreters proper behavior. In Italy, there's a different culture, and the interpreters needed to be aware of that. And they were my ears in a way, of course. So I needed to find interpreters who wouldn't cause a large war to break out because they had a misunderstanding of the culture in the country that they were in, Italy for this case. It's easy enough to teach physics, but it's very difficult to teach behavior and appropriate behavior. My passion also is physics, not behavior, so I don't want that to be my responsibility. So now for the standard model. If you know ASL Clear, the website, they have this sign for chemical elements. For example, carbon. You can show the element carbon. Now in physics, we have a particle, and then we have our standard model that shows various particles. And we borrowed the concept from the periodic table of elements to create the standard model of particles. In this picture here, you can see different letters, and each letter represents a different type of particle. For example, different people have different names, like Peter or me, Giordon. And then you're given a name sign, right? If you're in the ASL community. So same with particles. We name these types of particles. And there are different ways to describe these types of particles. For example, the C or the U or the T. Then there are also mass, charge, and spin that are involved in particles. Not the spin that you might think of, but it's different now. English is weird because we call it spin, but it's not an actual spin. So this is the sign that we use for spin that we are talking about. It's like measuring dimensions. So then you can look at a particle and see if it has spin, its mass, etc. And then you find whether it matches the U, T, C, D, S, B, so on and so forth, so that you know what to call that particle. Just like a chemical is measured by atoms, like carbon or oxygen, just for example. So there are somewhat two different groups or categories here also, but this is just a brief explanation of the standard model. There is a right and a wrong way to classify these.
So this is also part of what I study, and this is a generational problem. So each of these quarks that you see here, the size is equivalent to the mass of the particle. So if the size looks very large, that means that it's very heavy. If the size here on the screen looks very small, that means that the particle is actually very light. And what you may notice here is that T, top, is extremely large, right? Very, very large. And then all of the others are so much smaller. And so many people wonder why the size differential is so great, why they vary so much. And the answer is that we don't know. That's an open question. So my job is to answer questions like that and to be part of research analysis that figures out even how we can answer that type of question. We know that the sizes are different, and we just found a particle in 2012 that may help us answer some of these questions. That particle was called the Higgs boson, and it is kind of called the God particle, but we are still searching and trying to find the answer. So the standard model introduces a number of different questions. So the previous slide gave an example of one question that we don't have the answer to, but really there are many more questions. So for example, what is dark matter is another question that we don't know the answer to. We can look up in the sky and we can analyze and measure, and we know that it's there. We know that dark matter is present, but we don't know what it's made of. We don't know what it's built of. We don't know if it's built of molecules or particles or something else. We just don't know the answer. And there are other questions like, where did all of the antimatter go? So for example, if you look at a table, or if you think about the Big Bang that started the universe 400 million years ago, that started from nothing, right? The Big Bang came from zero. And so if it started with nothing, that means that the Big Bang is created an amount of matter that we see all around us, and it must have also created an equivalent amount of antimatter that we cannot see. And so now we suspect that there's more matter than antimatter. So where did the antimatter go? Is it just gone? Where is it? We just don't know the answer to that. So there are a number of different questions that we can try to answer. And for now, we're primarily focused on one theory that may help answer some of these questions. And that theory is called the supersymmetry theory, or SUSY, like Susie. So a thing to know about CERN is that the CERN is an international lab, and the lab is housed on top in a large building. There are a number of different departments within the lab. And there are also a number of different experiments that are run within CERN. And then the Large Hadron Collider, the LHC, is one of those many experiments. So on the left, the white line that you see is the border between France and Switzerland. And this is a view looking underground. So the LHC is actually 100 meters underground. And it's 27 kilometers around. And it's completely underground. It's not above ground at all. It's completely underground, 100 meters underground. The LHC is the Large Hadron Collider. And the LHC is composed of there are 4 different points where collisions happen. There are 4 different colliders within the LHC at different points within the machine, and each of the colliders has detectors, extremely large machines that detect. And I work specifically at the Atlas Collider, which is the picture that you see on the right. So that's one of the 4 colliders. And you can see the small people standing in front of the Atlas Collider. That gives you a sense of how large it is. I have another picture to show you that too. So this is a picture of me standing in front of the collider. And do you remember the picture that I took with the 3 interpreters? These are the same interpreters at the bottom left there. So that gives you an idea of the size of the collider. It's extremely big, right? It's 100 meters deep and underground too. So it's very large, very deep underground. It is very safe though, most of the time. So there are 4 sections: the inner detector, the muon spectrometer, the calorimeters, and then the trigger. There are 4 different systems that operate within Atlas. And these support taking pictures of collisions. So for a collision, there are protons and particles that collide with each other. And we want to take pictures of those collisions and save those pictures. So we're measuring energy and movement and where the particles are and where the collisions happen. And the system that we developed is the system that I support, is for measuring positive and negative particles and also for measuring their tracks. So particles have positive and negative charge as they move through the collider. And so we can see when that charge occurs. The calorimeter specifically also measures the hadrons that are present within the collision too. So there are a number of different rules and things that apply here. Everything is complex and part of this detector. So I want to talk a little bit more about the trigger and why that's important. So we're taking pictures of the collisions, and we don't just take one single picture of the collision, but every single second we take 40 million pictures over the course of the collision. And of course, it's not possible for us to save them all. There isn't any possible hardware that would have the capacity to be able to save all of those. So we have to decide which of those photos is worth keeping and which of them is not. So in order to do that, we've developed a trigger system. And the trigger system is an automatic way of cutting those pictures or in other words, of deciding which of the pictures are worth saving and which of them aren't. So it automates that process. So of the 40 million pictures that we take, we typically only save about 1,000 of them. So that's a very small percentage of the 40 million. And that's all we can possibly take. So all of that is data, and the trigger system was part of my thesis specifically. There are 3 points where interesting collisions happen. There are a number of points in the system where there are no interesting collisions that happen. Physics already knows about those. But there are 3 points that are particularly interesting where the pictures we take need to be saved. But that also has to be automatic and fast. It wouldn't be fast enough for a human to be taking those pictures. So we developed the trigger to give us about 1,000 pictures for every second. Sometimes a little bit over, sometimes a little bit under, but on average, it's about 1,000 pictures that we save per second. So those are the goals of the trigger. And for the most part, it succeeds. The picture there is more of a description of the structure behind the trigger. So all parts of the system have to work together to create this type of picture. Now, this is not an actual picture that would have been taken, but we save the raw data in bytes, and then we analyze it and create pictures from the data that we collect during the collisions. So here you can see the Atlas detector, and this is a cross shot of it. So we're looking at it from the center. And the green is light. The yellow is charge. Those are the tracks of charged particles as they move through the collider. So it's one way to look at the picture, and I wanted to show the picture because I think it's very cool. The point here is that working for CERN also means traveling around the world, traveling internationally. So I have some of these different pictures from the places that I've been. And for example, not to name drop here, but the second picture on the left with the blue background, sitting next to me in that picture are Ian and Mel, and the 3 of us also work together to give an ASE presentation. On improving engineering education for deaf students. We wanted to include a number of different perspectives there. So that was a fun conference. That presentation included a lot of poetry in front of a hearing audience as well. And then on the right side, the green picture that you see, that's at CMS. If you remember, there are the 4 different colliders. There are the 4 locations within CERN. Atlas is one of them. And another large one is CMS. And so that's a picture of CMS. It looks somewhat similar to Atlas, but it's a little bit different too. So I put this in because I think it's funny, but really people always ask me how I've been able to navigate through, the different struggles that I've had in life and, questions like that. And really this picture answers it. I think the key is perseverance, and you can see that here. I think this is a perfect meme to show those barriers and the value of perseverance.
All right. Well, thank you so much.